Picture a world with no shorelines left, only gray water reaching to the edge of the sky, and somewhere on that water, so small it could be mistaken for driftwood, a single wooden chest adrift with no shore in sight. Inside sit two people, husband and wife, the only human beings left alive on the entire earth. Every farmer, every child, every city they had ever known lies beneath the water they are floating on. How does a whole world come to drown, and how do exactly two people survive it? This is the Greek flood myth, and it is far older than most people realize. The Greeks were already telling it long before anyone had heard of Noah, complete with a devastated world, righteous survivors, and a haunting instruction from an oracle that neither of them wanted to believe. "Walk out into the ruins of the world," the oracle told them, "and throw the bones of your mother behind you." What could that possibly mean when both of their mothers were long dead and buried far from that place? If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. But to understand how the water ever rose that high, the story has to start earlier, with a god who came down from Olympus to see, with his own eyes, exactly how far his creation had fallen. Long before the flood, in the age the poets called the Age of Bronze, humanity had curdled into something Zeus could hardly recognize. Guests were turned away from doors that should have welcomed them, oaths were sworn and broken in the same breath, and the old sacred duty of hospitality, feeding the stranger, sheltering the traveler, had been abandoned in town after town. Rumors of this cruelty drifted up to Olympus, and rumor was not enough for Zeus, so the king of the gods came down disguised as an ordinary traveler, dust on his sandals and nothing about him to suggest divinity, to see the truth of it for himself. What he found on that journey convinced him something had gone badly wrong with his creation. In the mountain kingdom of Arcadia, he came at last to the hall of a king named Lycaon, who tested his disguised guest with a crime so monstrous, serving him a meal no god should ever have been asked to eat, that Zeus turned the king into a wolf, where he stood and sent him howling into the forest. For Zeus, Lycaon's crime was not an isolated horror. It was proof that an entire species had rotted past saving. Returning to Olympus, the king of the gods gathered the other immortals and told them plainly what he intended to do: send a flood so vast that no mountain, no palace, no city wall would remain above the water, and wipe away everything humanity had become. Most of the gods, weary of mortal cruelty themselves, offered no objection to the plan. But one figure from the old generation could not simply stand by, and that was Prometheus, the titan who had shaped the first humans out of clay and who was already paying a heavy price for defying Zeus once before, chained at that very time to a mountain at the edge of the world for the crime of giving mankind fire. Even in chains, though, forethought was the very meaning of his name, and he could still see what was coming. Word reached his son Deucalion in a dream, the old tellings say, though no one has ever quite explained how a message crossed that distance, warning him that Zeus's patience with the human race had finally run out. Deucalion was a quiet, thoughtful man known across the region for his decency, married to a woman named Pyrrha, the gentle and clear-eyed daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. Neither of them had ever turned a stranger from their door, and neither had raised a hand against the gods. So when the warning came, Deucalion trusted it completely. Build a great wooden chest, the message told him, large enough to hold the two of them together, strong enough to survive whatever the sea and sky were about to do, and stock it with food enough to last many days. Whatever they heard in the coming nights, however loud the thunder grew, they were to finish the chest before the first rain fell. When the rain finally came, it did not build slowly across an afternoon sky the way an ordinary storm does. It came as though the sky itself had been struck open. Zeus gathered every cloud in the heavens into one enormous churning mass and let loose a rain that did not pause for a single hour, day after day, while thunder rolled continuously overhead like some vast machinery grinding into motion. Not satisfied with rain alone, Zeus called on his brother Poseidon, lord of the sea, to add his own strength to the ruin, and Poseidon loosed the rivers from their banks and pushed the ocean itself inland, wave after wave climbing over fields and orchards that had never known the sea's touch. Together the rain from above and the sea from below rose so fast that villages vanished beneath the water within a single night. Farmhouses went under with their roofs still standing, visible for a moment beneath the surface before the water closed over them entirely. Hillsides disappeared. Whole forests stood drowned to their highest branches, and then not even those branches remained above the surface. Fish, the old poets say with a kind of grim wonder, swam among the drowned roof beams of houses and through the upper windows of temples where people had once prayed. Everywhere the water reached, it reached completely, with no shallow end to this flood and no high ground left untouched. Only one thing on the whole earth still floated, a single wooden chest sealed tight against the storm, carrying two people who had listened when a warning came. Inside the chest, Deucalion and Pyrrha could hear nothing but water, the endless drumming of rain on the wood above them, and beneath that, the deep, slow groan of the sea itself, vast and directionless, carrying them wherever it pleased. There was no way to know which direction led to land, because there was no longer any land to search for. Days passed in that darkness, the two of them rationed and quiet, feeling the chest rise and fall over swells too large to imagine, waiting for a silence that would not come. When Deucalion finally dared to open a small gap and look out, he saw only gray water reaching to every horizon, unbroken by so much as a treetop or a rooftop, the sky above it the same flat, colorless gray as the sea below. 9 days and 9 nights, the chest drifted like that, the old tellings say, alone on a world that had become entirely ocean, with no bird to send out searching for land, because there was no land left for any bird to find. Pyrrha wept quietly through much of that drifting, not from fear of dying, but from a growing certainty about what waited for them if they lived, a world with no one left in it but the two of them. Whether the water was truly beginning to slow, or whether it only felt that way after so many days, neither of them could say. But on the 10th day, without warning, the chest stopped drifting and came to a sudden, grinding halt. The chest had come to rest on the only piece of the world still visible above the water, the high, jagged summit of Mount Parnassus, standing now like a lonely island in an ocean that covered everything else. When Deucalion pried open the lid and the two of them climbed out onto bare, wet stone, they found a silence unlike anything either of them had ever known. No bird song, no wind moving through leaves, because there were no leaves left for miles below the summit. No distant sound of a city, a herd, a river, or a single human voice. Only the slow lap of water against rock, and beyond that, nothing at all. Slowly, cautiously, as the flood began its long retreat over the following days, Deucalion and Pyrrha made their way down from the peak into a valley that had once held farms and roads and a scattering of small villages. What they found instead was mud, endless gray mud, cracking in the returning sun, littered with the broken timbers of houses and the twisted debris of a world the water had simply erased. There was no one left to find, no ruins of anyone to grieve over directly. The flood, in its completeness, had left behind only silence and absence, a whole landscape scoured down to its bones. Pyrrha stood in that emptied valley and understood, more fully than any warning could have prepared her for, exactly what it meant to be one of the last two people on Earth. Somewhere beneath their feet lay everything and everyone that had ever lived there, with no one left to mourn them except the two people standing in the mud. Grief and loneliness might easily have ended the story there, with two survivors wandering a ruined world with no purpose left to serve. But Deucalion and Pyrrha were not the kind of people who gave up easily, and somewhere in the wreckage of the valley they found something the flood had spared. A small stone temple, half buried in mud but still standing, sacred to the goddess Themis, the ancient keeper of divine law and order. If any power on earth could tell them what to do next, they reasoned, it would be her. They cleared what mud they could from the temple steps and knelt together before her altar, asking a single, desperate question. How could two people possibly restore a world this empty, And was there any purpose left for them to serve at all? Themis answered, but not in words either of them had hoped to hear. A voice moved through the temple, cool and ancient, and gave them an instruction that made no sense at all. Leave this place, cover your heads, loosen the belts of your robes, and throw the bones of your mother behind you as you walk. Then the presence behind the voice fell silent again. Pyrrha was horrified. Her own mother, Pandora, was long dead, her bones resting somewhere far from that mountain, and the thought of disturbing them, of throwing a dead woman's bones over her shoulder like refuse, struck her as such a betrayal that she refused outright to consider it. What kind of goddess, she asked, would demand something so monstrous of two people who had already lost everything? For a long while, neither of them could see past the horror of the words to whatever truth might be hiding underneath them. It was Deucalion, turning the riddle over and over as they sat in the ruined temple, who finally saw past its surface to what Themis had actually meant. A goddess who spoke in ancient riddles would not casually demand something so grotesque, he reasoned. There had to be another mother hidden inside her words, one far older than either of their own. And there was, the earth itself, the great mother of every living thing, whom the Greeks called Gaia. If the earth was their true mother, then her bones could only be one thing: the stones scattered across the barren valley floor, the hard rock beneath the mud that had outlasted the flood, the way bones outlast flesh. It was a strange leap of logic, and neither of them could be fully certain it was right, but it was the only reading of the riddle that did not demand something unthinkable. So the two of them walked down from the temple with their heads covered and their robes loosened, exactly as they had been told, and began gathering stones from the drying ground. Without looking back, they threw the stones over their shoulders, one after another, onto the empty earth behind them. What happened next, the old poets swear, defied everything either of them understood about the world. The stones Deucalion threw began to soften and lengthen where they struck the ground, taking on shoulders, then arms, then the unmistakable shape of men rising out of the mud. The stones Pyrrha threw did the same, but softer and slighter, rising as women, until the empty valley that had held nothing but silence an hour before now held dozens of new people, blinking in the sunlight, born from rock and earth rather than from any womb. It is easy, at first, to hear the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha as a simple tale about survival, and in one sense, it is exactly that. But there is something quieter and more remarkable underneath it. The flood came because a species had grown careless with the things that were supposed to hold it together: hospitality, honesty, respect for guest and stranger and God alike. And what saved the world afterward was not a hero's sword or a clever trick, but two ordinary, decent people who kept faith with a warning they did not fully understand and obeyed a riddle they did not want to be true. Deucalion and Pyrrha went on to have children of their own after that day on the mountain, and their line, the old genealogies claim, became the ancestors of every Greek who ever lived, which means that every hero, every king, every name in the old stories traces back, in some telling or another, to a chest that floated on the flood and a hillside scattered with stones. Perhaps that is the real ending worth remembering, not the destruction of an old world, but the strange, stubborn patience it took two people to build a new one thrown stone at a time. If you enjoy stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like to hear next. Sleep well.